This morning is week 3 in our series entitled Avoiding the Pitfalls of Life. So let me give you the third pitfall that you need to be aware of. It's called egoism. Not egotism, egoism. Now let me explain the difference. Egotism is when you think more highly of yourself than you ought to. In fact, Paul warned us about this. The majority of people think more highly of themselves than they ought to. And so Paul wants to make sure that we know we shouldn't do that. So turn with me, if you would, in Romans chapter 12, verse number 3. Notice what Paul writes. I give each of you this warning. Why is it a warning? Because it's dangerous to do what he's getting ready to say. So he says, I give each of you this warning. Don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourself. Now, you have to be honest in evaluating yourself. If I didn't think that I could teach, then I wouldn't be up here. But I believe that God gifted me to be a teacher. And as a result of that, I get up every Sunday morning and I teach from the Bible. But I have to honestly evaluate myself. Sometimes after the service, I'll tell my wife, boy, I struck out. Other times, I feel like I did really well. But I want to honestly evaluate myself. But I'm always amazed at the people who don't honestly evaluate themselves. They'll say, I think I can really sing, Pastor Allen. I'd like to be on the worship team. And I listen to them and I think, I know nothing about music, but the one thing I know, you can't sing. But it's because some people think more highly of themselves than they ought to. And it can hurt our feelings when we think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. And everyone else says, no, you're kidding yourself. But that's what I want you to see. Paul gives us this warning and says not to think more highly of yourself than you ought to. So egotism is when you think more highly of yourself than you ought to. In fact, you think that you are superior to others. You are better than others. But I'm not talking about egotism, I'm talking about egoism. So what is egoism? Egoism is when you're so self-centered you only consider yourself and your own interest. As a result, you have a total disregard for how your actions will affect others. If your actions hurt somebody else, well, I'm sorry, that's just too bad. You're going to live your life the way that you want to, regardless of how it might affect other people. That's egoism. And a person who acts that way is called an egoist. In fact, let me explain the difference between an egotist, an egoist, and someone who's narcissistic. Because sometimes we use those as synonyms, and they're not synonyms. I've even heard licensed counselors and psychologists use those three terms as if they were synonyms, and they are not synonyms. So let me explain the difference. An egotist believes that he is superior to others or that he's better than others. An egoist doesn't necessarily feel that way. In fact, he might even feel like everyone else is better than him. But he's so self-centered, he only cares about himself and his own self-interest. A narcissist is an egotist that takes it a step further. Not only do narcissists think that they're superior to others, but they're also preoccupied with themselves. And they're willing to take advantage of others because in their mind, they're the only ones that really matter. So they'll step on other people, they'll betray other people, they'll manipulate people, they'll try and control other people because they think they're the only ones that really matter. Think of it like this. All narcissists are egotists, but not all egotists, but not all egotists are narcissists. So, as you can see, these three terms are closely related to each other, but there is a subtle difference between the three. You see, you don't have to be an egotist to be an egoist. Neither do you have to be a narcissist to be an egoist. And it's important that you understand that because so many people are egoistic and they don't even realize it. They're not egotistical. They're not narcissistic, but they are egoistical. Now, let me give you an extreme example in order to illustrate that you don't have to be egotistical or narcissistic in order to be egoistic. And the example I want to give you is extreme. It's suicide. A young person who commits suicide isn't egotistical. In fact, they're usually the exact opposite of someone who's an egotist. Instead of feeling like they're superior to others, they wonder, what's wrong with me? Why am I not like everyone else? Why am I like this? Why do I feel this way? And they're not narcissistic normally. They don't have an inflated sense of their own importance. And they usually have empathy for others. Rather than a lack of empathy. So they're not narcissistic. But the pain and the despair inside of them is so great that it puts them in a place where they don't even think about what their death might do to other people, to those that love them. That never crosses their mind. And if it does, it's far outweighed by the grief and the despair that they're feeling. In fact, all they can think about is ending their pain. All they can think about is ending their suffering and their feelings of despair. The truth is, in that condition, they are, in every sense of the word, an egoist. Because they're not even thinking about how their death is going to affect those that love them. Yeah. Let me tell you, nothing is worse for a parent than to lose a child to suicide. I've been in full-time ministry for 36 years. I can't tell you how many weddings I've performed, how many funerals I've performed, and I have done services for those who have committed suicide. And let me say this, there's nothing worse for a parent than to lose a child to suicide. Nothing. And the reason I say that is because on top of the grief, there's this overwhelming guilt. They're wondering, what did I do wrong? Or what didn't I do that made this child of mine want to take their life? They're asking themselves over and over again, what could I have done, or what should I have done, or why didn't I see that my child was hurting like this? Why did I downplay it? Why did I think, oh, that's normal, they're just a teenager, or maybe they're just in college? Why didn't I see that? Let me tell you, nothing is worse for a parent than to lose a child to suicide, because not only do you have the grief, but you will always carry the rest of your life the guilt on top of the grief that for some reason your child was so much in pain they took their own life. Now, I realize that suicide is an extreme example to use, but what I wanted you to see is that you don't have to be an egotist or you don't have to be narcissistic to be an egoist. An egoist is simply a person who becomes so self-centered, they only consider themselves in their own interest. And when a person commits suicide, most of the time they're not an egotist, they're not narcissistic. But I want you to understand something. In their grief, in their pain, and in their suffering, in their despair, they become so self-centered, they can't think about anyone else. They can only think about the pain that they're going through. And as a result, they have a total disregard for how their actions are going to affect others. If their actions hurt somebody else, I'm sorry, I'm just in so much pain. That's just too bad. They're going to live their life or even take their life because it's theirs to live or it's theirs to take. So you don't have to be egotistical or narcissist to be egoistical. And that's what I want you to see. That's the point that I'm trying to make with that extreme example. You don't have to be egotistical. You don't have to be narcissistic in order to be an egoist. And the reason I bring that up is because many of you have children who are egoists. And you go, well, it can't be. They're not egotistical. No. They're not narcissistic. No. But that doesn't mean they're not an egoist. And I want you to understand that. Because in today's society, egoism is becoming more and more common, especially among young people. And there are two reasons for this. The first reason has to do with our culture. Believe it or not, our culture actually promotes egoism. The message it promotes is, it's your life. You live it the way you want to. And let me give you two examples. All the commercials you see, all the movies you watch, all of these TV series that you love, I want you to understand, there's one message they're pushing out to our young people, and it's this: you deserve to be happy. Look at all the commercials. We can make you happy if you drive this car, or if you wear these clothes, or if you wear this perfume or cologne. And you deserve to be happy. Yeah. Look at the LGBTQ agenda. You know, I'm telling you, they're pushing these kids to do certain things and to be certain ways. And what they're telling them is, you deserve to be happy. And what they don't understand is, when they push those kids to become that way, they're the most unhappy. In fact, suicide reigns supreme among those in the LGBTQ community. And I hate that. But I want you to understand that's what's taking place. The message it promotes is, you deserve to be happy. The second reason has to do with poor parenting. Today, parents tend to believe that their main goal is to make their kids happy. So the kids come to believe that the parent's job is to make them happy, to do whatever is necessary to make them happy. Listen to me, parents. Your goal as a parent is to raise your children to be godly and independent. Your goal is not to make them happy. In fact, if your goal is to make your children happy, then there's a greater chance that your kids are going to grow up to be unhappy. Does anyone know why that is? Well, let me tell you why. People who are emotionally healthy are people who are happy. People who are emotionally unhealthy are unhappy. And if your goal is to make your kids happy, then you'll probably raise your kids in such a way that they will become emotionally unhealthy. And if your kids are raised to be emotionally unhealthy, I guarantee you they are going to be unhappy in life. I promise you that. But if your children are raised to be emotionally healthy, they're going to be happy. Happiness and gratefulness go hand in hand. In fact, let me go a little bit further. I teach on how to be happy. People think sometimes that that's not spiritual, but I want you to understand the Bible teaches us how to be happy. And Jesus actually teaches a parable that tells us the secret to happiness. And here's what he tells us. He tells us that happiness is not contingent upon circumstances. Happiness is contingent upon our perspective of those circumstances. Some of the most unhappy people are people that have everything in life, and we think, boy, they ought to be happy, and they're not happy. You want to know why? They're not emotionally healthy, and they have the wrong perspective. But the kids that grow up to be emotionally healthy and have the right perspective on life, guess what? They don't even think about it, but they're happy. I don't want to lord it over you, but let me tell you, you're looking at the most happy person on this earth. I have a grandchild. But you know why I'm happy? I've got a great wife. I've got a great job. I have 2 children that love the Lord and are saved and going to heaven. They have husbands that love the Lord and are saved and going to heaven. I have a grandchild that's going to be raised in a godly home, so I have every belief that I'll see my grandchild in heaven. And when I look at all of these things, even though the circumstances are there, I want you to understand, it's my perspective, these circumstances. I understand I have a lot to be grateful for, and as a result of that, I'm just extremely happy. But many of you whose goal is to make your children happy, all you're doing is raising them to be unhappy. Yeah, it's true. Today's parents also tend to believe that they need to be a friend to their children. So they need to be cool and hip and not set rules or boundaries or use punitive discipline techniques. And they avoid setting high expectations for your children. Let me just give you a little bitty brief clip here. This has nothing to do with what I'm teaching on. But parents, you should be setting high standards for your children. High expectations. You want to know why? Children live up to your expectations. It's true. But most parents, they want to be cool and hip. They don't want to set rules or boundaries. They don't want to use punitive discipline techniques. They want to avoid setting high expectations for the children, which sends a very clear message to your children. It's your life. You can do with it what you please. So even though their kids aren't egotistical or narcissistic, they are egoistical. Yeah. So because of our culture and because of our poor parenting, kids tend to think that it's all about them. It's all about their happiness and what they want to do with their life, regardless of how it affects others. They've been led to believe that it's your life. You can live it any way you want to, regardless of how it affects other people. But parents, listen to me. Life does not work that way. It doesn't work that way because life is all about relationships. And that means that we're interconnected with each other. So your children need to be taught that their actions affect others, not just themselves. What they do affects their family. And they have a responsibility to take that into account before they act, and not to do so is wrong. It affects you as a parent. And they have a responsibility to take that into account before they act, and not to do so is wrong. It affects their siblings. And they have a responsibility to take that into account before they act, and not to do so is wrong. And there's even the possibility that their actions might affect their friends, their community, and even our country. Let me give you something that's a little bit about my personal life. I had great parents. Raised me in a conservative home. That makes them great right there. raised me in a Christian home. But they had 5 kids. So I have 4 siblings. 3 brothers, 1 sister. And I can still remember my dad when we were young. Grade school, junior high, high school. My dad would always say this: you bear the family name. Don't you get out in public and bring shame to this family. Don't you get out and bring shame to our name. And you know, I look at my two of my brothers, and I look at my sister, and I realize that they took that to heart, and so did I. I have 3 great siblings. My oldest brother retired at 61, very successful in life. Decided, I don't want to work anymore. Won't take Social Security till he's 70 because he doesn't have to. Made wise decisions. My sister is a doctor. Very good doctor. My brother is a doctor. I'm a pastor. But we have 1 sibling that never took that to heart. And they've done everything in the world that you could imagine to bring shame on the family. And here's what's sad. It doesn't matter that there's 4 of us kids that have lived for Jesus, that have made wise decisions, that have tried to bring honor to the name of Nolan. We have 1 that didn't. And here's what's interesting. When I'm introduced to people who are familiar with Tahlequah, maybe grew up here, they'll want to know, is so-and-so your brother? And it's not the 2 that have done right. They never ask if Carol's my sister, or Riddell's my brother, or Doug's my brother. They always want to know about the other one. And that's the one that people think about when they hear the word Nolan. And I think about that. So you can imagine what I did as a parent. When my kids got older, I would say, listen to me, you bear the Nolan name. Don't you get out in public and bring shame to our family. Don't you get out in public and bring shame to the name. Thank God neither one of them did. But I want you to understand, that's the way life works, whether we like it or not. And our children need to learn that. They need to learn that life is not all about them. And their actions have consequences. Not just consequences for themselves, but also consequences for the other people that they love, those who are connected to them. Because if they don't learn this as children, they won't know it as adults. And they will always be egoistical. And it won't even occur to them that what they do or don't do will affect their spouse. It will affect their children. I am amazed at how many people who have children will just so easily dissolve their marriage. And you have no idea what it does to your children. No idea. It even affects extended family. And even if it does occur to them, they'll think that it really doesn't matter because after all, they deserve to be happy. In fact, if you're wondering, am I egoistical? Not egotistical, egoistical. Because remember, you don't have to be an egotist. You don't have to be egotistical. You don't have to be narcissistic to be egoistical. So you might be wondering, am I egoistical? Well, let me ask you a question. Do you think that you deserve to be happy? Because that's the beginning of it. If you think you deserve to be happy, then it really doesn't matter what you do and how it affects others because you have a right to be happy. Doesn't matter what it does to your children. Doesn't matter what it does to your spouse. Doesn't matter what it does to your extended family. You deserve to be happy. It's your life, and you have a right to do with it whatever you want. But people, I'm here to tell you that's hogwash. And the person who thinks that will end up not only hurting themselves, but also hurting those that they supposedly love. Now, if you don't believe this, if you don't believe that your actions have the ability to not only affect you, but also others, just look at Adam and Eve. Their actions affected the whole world. Just one act. Just one act. Turn to Romans chapter 5, verse number 12, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Notice what it says. When Adam sinned, that's written in the aorist tense. That means it's punctiliar action. It means it's talking about one particular sin. And we all know what it is. What is the sin that Adam did? He ate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree that God said not to eat of. Don't eat the fruit from that tree. And he did it. So notice what it says. When Adam sinned, when he did this particular sin, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death. So death spread to everyone, for everyone sinned. In other words, it produced the Adamic nature. And through having sexual relationships with Eve, he produced children after its own kind, and everyone that was born has the Adamic nature. And because everyone has the Adamic nature, it brings forth death. Now, our actions might not affect others to the extent that Adam and Eve's did, but our actions do affect those around us, and especially our loved ones. So whether we want to admit it or not, what we do affects others, and people, that's just the way life works. So if you think that it's your life and you can do whatever you want, and it really doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, I want you to understand that's hogwash. That's hogwash. It does not work that way. Now, normally by the time an egoist figures this out, they've already done not only serious harm to themselves, but also to those they love. And it can't be undone. A good example of this is Achan. How many of you are familiar with the story of Achan? Well, if you're not familiar with it, turn with me, if you would, to the book of Joshua. We're going to read chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. I'm only going to read the parts that really matter so you can get the gist of the story. But let me show you how Achan's actions not only harmed himself, but also harmed those he loved, but it went a step further. It also harmed those he didn't even know. Yeah, those who weren't even a part of his family. So notice what it says in Joshua chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. Jericho and everything in it must be completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. Now, this is what God is telling the Israelites. Okay, this is first fruits. This is going to be the very first city you conquer in the promised land. And because it's the first, it's first fruits. It belongs to me. So notice what he says. Everything in it must be completely destroyed as an offering to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and the others in her house will be spared, for she protected our spies. Sowing and reaping principle. Do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Not just yourself. You will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made from silver, gold, bronze, or iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into his treasury. Now, I want you to notice that God gave specific instructions to the Israelites right before they attacked Jericho. And he told them, don't take anything from Jericho, because if you do, you're going to bring a curse upon the whole camp, and you'll bring a death sentence upon yourself. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you know what Achan did. What did he do? He disobeyed, and he took some of the things from Jericho, and he went and hid them. He was going to bring them out later after they conquered other cities and act like he took it from them. Turn to Joshua chapter 7, verse number 1. Notice what it says. But Israel violated the instructions about the things set apart for the Lord. A man named Achan. Now wait a minute. God says Israel violated the instructions. In other words, the whole nation did it, but only one man actually performed the act. Do you see that? A man named Achan hid or had stolen some of the dedicated things, so the Lord was very angry with the Israelites. Achan was the son of Carmi, a descendant of Zimri, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah. Now I want you to notice that even though Achan was the one who stole all of the items, all of Israel was affected. You see, because sin was in the camp, all of the camp was affected. So when they went against the next city, Ai, they were defeated. In fact, 36 Israelites were killed when they went against Ai, which led to Achan's sin being exposed. And once it was exposed, Achan was put to death along with his family. Now, I personally believe that the reason God dealt so harshly with Achan is because he wanted to teach Israel a very important spiritual lesson. And that very important spiritual lesson is this. If you're taking notes, write this down. A person's sin affects more than just him. It also affects his family. But let me go a little bit further. It even extends beyond his family. I want you to understand that when you sin, it doesn't just affect you. It affects your family. And many times it extends past your family. Sometimes we get to complaining when we go to the grocery store how expensive things are. But I want you to understand, every time someone steals, then we have to pay a little bit more in order to make up for what the grocery store lost when that person stole it. You are paying for their sin. Every time someone commits a crime and they go to jail, and yes, they have to pay court costs, but I want you to understand, we're having to pay for the jail that was built. We're having to pay to feed them and support them. It doesn't bother me what the sheriff is doing in Arizona at all, because they need to understand that their sin didn't just affect them. Their sin affects everyone. And this is something God wanted us to see early on. So we get right out of the Pentateuch and we go into the book of Joshua, where the children of Israel are going in the promised land. And the very first lesson they learn is this: your sin doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone else. Yeah. And people, I see that time and time again. If there's constant conflict in the home, it affects the children. In fact, children who grow up in dysfunctional homes become dysfunctional themselves. And they raise dysfunctional children, and that continues on for generation after generation until that curse is broke. Everyone wants to know how to fix poverty. Honey, you can't fix poverty because poverty is a mindset and it's in the home. The only way you can fix it is for that person to understand what the root cause of poverty is, because they're passing that on from generation to generation. Poverty is a generational curse. And the only way that we can fix that is to get people out of that mindset, educate them on what they can do in order to prosper. But as long as they continue to do the things that they do, it doesn't matter how much you give them, they will still remain in that condition. That's what the Bible teaches. You might not like that I teach you the truth, but I'm sorry. That's what the Bible teaches. You want to know why we're having such problems in the schools today? It's because of the home. We expect teachers to be parents also. They're not just expected to teach your children, they're expected to be a parent and teach values. Something is wrong. We see all of these parents on drugs and don't even care about their children. Those drugs are more important than their own children. My daughter's an OB-GYN and she says, "Dad, you just wouldn't believe it. All of the mothers, they're addicted to drugs and don't even care that they're pregnant. The drugs are more important than their children." Blows my mind. But it all goes back that I deserve to be happy. It's my life. I can do with it whatever I want. Now, some of you are probably wondering, can an egoist change? Well, the answer is yes. They can change. But he or she needs to do it as quickly as possible. Because if you wait too long, it might be too late. In fact, let me give you an example to illustrate what I'm talking about. I have an aunt. She's passed away. In fact, she was my favorite aunt. I don't even mind giving you her name. If you're from Stillwell, you might know her. But she was always my favorite aunt, Aunt Maxine. She fell in love with a worthless young man. The Bible would call him the son of Belial. Belial simply means worthless. So as you go through the Old Testament, you're reading the Bible, you'll keep finding that so-and-so was the son of Belial. And if you don't understand what it means, you'll go, boy, Belial sure got around. No. Belial means worthless. And that phrase, son of, simply means the characteristics of. If you're a son of a gun, I guess you got a characteristic of a gun and you're just explosive. I don't know what that means. But anyways, that's what son of means. Jesus came along and he was the Son of Man. What does that mean? It means he had the characteristics of man, but he was much more than a man. He was God. That's why he called himself Son of Man. Everyone else will, well, yeah, we know you're the Son of Man. You have the characteristics of man. You're a man. And he was a man. But he was also God, the God-man. So you need to understand. She fell in love with this son of Belial, this worthless person. And my grandfather knew that he was worthless. His whole family was worthless. Remember the generational curses. And he forbid her from seeing him, from dating him. But she was in love. So one night she ran off with him to get married. They eloped. And they moved to California. And several months later, she got pregnant. That's when he decided he didn't want to be married. And he definitely didn't want children. So he left her because, get this, he deserved to be happy. Oh yeah. It was his life. He should be able to live it on his terms. And he wasn't ready for kids. So he deserted her and his unborn child. Of course, she came back home, got a divorce, had a son, and then she met another man who was a great man, and of course my grandfather approved of him, so they got married. And he raised her son as if he was his own son. In fact, they never actually told my cousin Bill that Paul wasn't his dad until the night before he got married. At the age of 24, he was going to get married, and my uncle came in and told him, he said, "Son, I need to tell you something. I'm not your dad. And I don't want you to think bad about your mom. But your mom ran off and eloped with the man. And when she became pregnant, he decided he didn't want kids and he didn't want a wife, and he left her, and she came home and divorced him, and I came along and I met your mom. And we got married. And I want you to know I'm not your dad, but I've always loved you as my own son and always will. I consider you to be my flesh and blood, and I always will. But you're getting ready to start a family, and I want you to know that even though you're not my son, I consider you my son, and you need to know that." Well, years later, my cousin Bill's real father called him up, and he wanted to start a relationship with him. And my cousin Bill told him, "I'm sorry, but I have a father, and I'm not interested. I want you to know I'm not bitter. I didn't even know that the man who raised me wasn't my own father till the night before I was married. But I want you to know that I have a dad, and it's a great relationship. So even though you reached out, I appreciate it, but I just don't have any desire to know you." Now, what I want you to see is by the time an egoist begins caring about others and how their actions might affect them, it's usually too late and the damage has already been done. So this morning, if you recognize that you might be an egoist, someone who's so self-centered that you only consider yourself and your own interest, then you need to change before it's too late. You need to change not only for the good of others, but also for your own good. Yeah. So how do you go about changing? Well, first of all, you need to realize that no man is an island unto himself. And again, I'm using that phrase in a different manner than what it was intended to be used. What I mean by that phrase is that we're connected to others and others are connected to us. Therefore, our actions don't just affect us, but they also affect those that we're connected to. Romans chapter 14, verse number 7 says, "For none of us live for ourselves alone." Some of you think you do. In fact, that's your intentions. I live for myself. But notice what the Bible says. None of us live for ourselves alone. And none of us die for ourselves alone. Now, if you read this in context, you'll notice I'm taking it a bit out of context, but the thought is still the same. And it's this. Our lives have the ability to affect others either in a positive way or in a negative way. But if we live for the Lord, we'll never have to worry about doing something that's going to affect others in a negative way. And that's why we're supposed to live for the Lord. In fact, in the very next verse, Romans chapter 14, verse number 8, it says, "For he that lives for the Lord," you're supposed to live for the Lord. And if you die for the Lord. But the reason he's saying that is we can't just live for ourselves. No man can do that. Because no man is an island unto himself. Everyone's connected to other people. And as a result of that, we need to determine if we're going to live for the Lord. Because if we live for the Lord, then our actions are not going to affect other people in a negative way. Yeah. Secondly, you need to realize that your personal sin has a way of hurting others, even if you don't intend for that to happen. Well, I never intended for that to happen. So it did. But that's what I hear all the time. When it causes problems with someone's children or their grandchildren, it causes problems in the marriage. And that person will always say, "Well, I never intended for that to happen." But it did. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 9, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. "You must not bow down to idols or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children." The entire family is affected. The entire family is affected. Even children of the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. For the very first time in American history, the majority of the children today are being raised in homes where neither parent is a Christian, and neither of their parents went to church, and neither side of their grandparents are Christians, and they didn't go to church either. So for the very first time, when I get up and talk about certain sins, I have to talk about why it is a sin. And when I talk about Jesus, I have to explain what Jesus did. Because for the very first time, the majority of kids that are in grade school today have no idea who Jesus is and what he did. Never been like that before in America. But you want to know what's taking place? We're down to the third and fourth generation. I'm a grandparent now, and I came to the club late. I'm 59 years old and I have one. That's not fair, is it? Some of you are 59 years old and you already have a great-grandchild. I went to see my granddaughter yesterday and we were walking in the neighborhood with her. And this guy pulls up in a truck. He looks to be about my age, about 60 years old. And he says, aren't those grandkids great? And I said, yeah, this is my first one. He says, I have 14. Braggart. And he says, I'm getting ready to have my first great-grandchild. I didn't say it, but I thought, boy, you started early, and they started early. But you know, what's kind of interesting, and I'm thinking about this, but with my grandchild, I'm looking at the good decisions my parents made, how it affected me, and the good decisions that I made and how it affected my children. And I just told my daughter, I expect to see my grandchild in heaven. I expect my grandchild to be raised in church. I expect you to raise her in such a way that she knows what a healthy marriage is. She understands what God's will is, and she does it. See, the majority of my friends, their parents didn't go to church. So they weren't raised in church. And they didn't raise their kids in church. And their kids have grown up and now they have grandchildren and they're not going to church. So we're down to the fourth and fifth generation of kids who have never ever been to church. Let me just say this. Your sin does not just affect you. As it says in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 9, I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected. Even children in the third and fourth generation of those who reject me. Here's what God is saying. God is saying, and you need to understand this verse. It's not that he's upset. He goes, you know what? I'm going to punish your kids for what you've done. God's not that way. In fact, the Bible actually says the children are not to be punished for the sins of the father. So what does this mean? What this means is God is just. And if you don't want to live for the Lord and raise your children for the Lord, he's not going to step in and go, well, you know what? I'm going to save your kids even though you haven't. Raise them right. Now, someone else might be praying for them and someone else might be witnessing to them, and hopefully they get saved. But I want you to understand something. What God is saying is the choice is yours and it's up to you, but you need to understand what you do will affect your entire family. If you don't take them to church, that's your prerogative. But if they're not raised in church, they probably won't be saved, and neither will their kids and neither will their grandkids. So you need to understand that, number two. And last but not least, number three, you need to get into the habit of looking for win-win situations. Everyone knows what a win-win situation is, right? One of the best ways to make sure that you're not an egoist, where you're only looking out for yourself, is you try to make sure that everything you do is a win-win situation. And what I mean by that is, when I buy something for someone, I want a good deal, but I want to make sure that I'm not skinning them. And when I sell something, I want to make sure that I'm getting top dollar for it, but I don't want such top dollar that it actually causes them to have a bad deal. I want to make sure that what I pray for not only benefits me, but it benefits others. Because I understand that God loves others just as much as he loves me. And the best way I can keep myself from being an egoist, only looking after myself and doing what I want, is to make sure that I'm always looking for win-win situations. And that's biblical. Look with me, if you would, in the book of Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. In other words, look for win-win situations, things that are good for you and things that are good for them. Now, every once in a while, I see someone's trying to skin me. I'm sorry, that's not good for me. No, I'm not going to buy that. No, I'm not going to partake of that. No, I'm not going to do that. That's not a win for me. But I want to make sure that it's not a win for me at someone else's expense. That's a win-win situation. And I love that. Don't merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. Now, here's what's funny. For some reason, when we don't just look out for our own personal interest, but also for the interest of others, the happier we become. In fact, notice what Paul said in Acts chapter 20, verse 35. And I have been a constant example of how you can help those in need by working hard. You should remember the words of the Lord Jesus. It is more blessed to give than to receive. And you know what's funny about this? He's quoting Jesus, but you won't find anywhere where Jesus said that. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus didn't say it, because he did say it. That's why Paul said, Jesus said it. But the reason you probably don't have in the gospel is because Jesus lived his whole life like that. Everything Jesus did was a win-win situation. He'd make sure that it benefited him, but it benefited others too at the same time. And I'll be honest, Jesus was happy. And sometimes when I look at Jesus, I think, how in the world could Jesus have been happy? If you ever study what his childhood was like, and the book of Psalms tells us what his childhood was like, believe it or not. If you never heard that sermon, you need to go back and listen to that sermon. But he had a horrible childhood, the way people treated him. He lost his father when he was young, became the man of the house. He had a person who was over his finances named Judas who was stealing. And he knew from the moment he was born that he was destined to die for the sins of the world. He started preparing his disciples long before it happened. This is what's going to happen. We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed. They're going to crucify me, but I'm doing it for the world. And they still didn't get it. But you know why Jesus was happy? Because it's more blessed to give than to receive. There is something about ministry. If you're depressed, let me tell you what you need to do. You need to minister to someone else. There is something about helping someone else that makes you feel good. And you want to know what that something else is? We're made in the image of God, and that's the way God is. And when we do what we see God doing, we fulfill our purpose. And because we're fulfilling our purpose, it makes us happy. Yeah. Now, why would I preach this? Because some of you are getting ready to not only ruin your life, but ruin your family's life. And ruin your kids' life. And it can affect all the way down to your grandkids and your great-grandkids. Some of you are raising your children in such a way where they'll become egoistical. And they will ruin not only maybe your life because you worry for them, but their spouse's life, their children's life, because you're raising them to think that they deserve to be happy, not knowing that happiness is a byproduct of your perspective and your gratefulness. Yeah. And in your quest to make sure that your kids are happy, you are raising them to be egoist. Everything that's contrary to what the Word of God says. So ultimately, you're raising your children to be unhappy.